The eventual loser in the battle of the Big Three was General Motors. From 1960 to 62, they excelled in providing secretive support for the dominant Pontiacs. But as Ford and Chrysler surfaced, GM retreated.
Joe Weatherly started driving for me in 1961. Well, we won the championship. Back then it was the Grand National Championship in 1962 and 1963. We were running a Pontiac. And we run Pontiac 61, 62, and we got up to about the middle of 63, and Pontiac had already told us that they would not be back next year, that they were pulling out their support and all this.
For Joe Weatherly, GM's pullout could have been disastrous. He won the championship in convincing fashion in 62, but in 63, Bud Moore told Joe he would only prepare his Pontiac for the major races. Weatherly would not be discouraged. He proceeded to bum rides from lesser-known car owners for the small events. In all, he drove for 10 different teams in 53 races. He squeaked by Richard Petty for his second NASCAR crown.
Little Joe was kind of a superstitious person. He had a pair of tennis shoes that needed to belong in the scrap barrel a long time ago, but he was sentimental to those shoes. He was real superstitious. If you threw a peanut in his car, he would not get in it until it was cleaned out.
They all named him the clown prince of racing in NASCAR and this stuff, and he's always like to pull jokes on everybody. And
Moore, Weatherly, and Turner, it used to be the driver could collect the money. When they collected the money, they kept going with it. We had to get it fixed, so we collected the money. We run a half a year and never get any money. They just take it and go home.
But when it come time to sit down in that race car, when they dropped that green flag, now it was all business. And Joe won a lot of races, and he was considered one of the greatest race drivers there ever was in NASCAR, and I consider him that myself.
Joe Weatherly was determined to run his absolute best at every race. Ironically, it could have been that drive that ended his career and his life. At Riverside in 1964, Joe fell out with transmission problems. He insisted the crew fix the car and get him back on the track.
We were only a couple of laps down, and Joe was really running hard, and he went into turn 5, and he lost the right front wheel cylinder, and the car got airborne, got in the wall going into turn 6. And I think right today, if we'd had the safety net on the side, the window, I think Joe would still be here today. The situation, he got into a concrete wall, and his head hit the wall.
Though his career was cut short, Joe Weatherly scraped his way to 25 victories, many of them in second-rate equipment. He also won 2 straight NASCAR championships, and one thing is sure, the Clown Prince always had fun in the process. Weatherly's death was the beginning of one of the most tragic seasons in NASCAR history. 4 months later, in the World 600, Ned Jarrett, Junior Johnson, and Fireball Roberts crashed. Fireball's car flipped over and flaming gasoline engulfed the cockpit.
My car remained upright all through this, and the cars landed, I guess, about 30 feet apart. So I immediately got out of my car and went over to see if I could help him, and he was in the process of coming out of his car. He had already unbuckled his seat belt and shoulder harness and was trying to crawl out, but his shoe apparently had gotten caught on something and was having a little bit of a struggle, so I just reached around his shoulders and jerked him and pulled him out, because remember, it ripped the top part of his shoe off.
Roberts was burned severely. He died 2 months later from complications. Sadly, Fireball had confided to friends that he was thinking of retiring after that fateful race.
And he said, I'm going back to Charlotte, and I'm going to drive that race. And he said, I've already talked to Ford, and they're going to let me out of the contract. And he said that I don't want to run that race. He said, but I really feel like I should, you know, finish it up because I qualified the car and all. But he said, after I qualified the car, I had a long talk with myself and decided to get the hell out of this thing.
The tragedies of '64 weren't over yet. In September, again at Charlotte, One of the sport's most popular young drivers, Jimmy Pardue, was killed during a tire test. By then, many drivers were calling for steps to improve safety. The Roberts accident prompted the use of fire-preventative fuel cells, and Goodyear developed the inner liner tire, which prevents loss of control in a blowout. But by far the biggest change came when NASCAR banned the Hemi engine.
They wanted to do something about not having that automobile so much better than the rest of them, because it was a little car compared to the rest of them. If you look back then, the Galaxy was a 4,200-pound car and a big, bulky thing, big flat nose on it. Chevrolet wasn't much better.
The old man said, look, we love Chrysler, and we love General Motors, and we love Ford, and we have friends in all of yours, but we love NASCAR the most. And in order for NASCAR to survive, we got to sell tickets, and we got to please the promoters around the country. And to please them, to sell the tickets, we must have close competition.
When NASCAR pulled the Hemi, Chrysler pulled out of NASCAR, taking some of the most popular drivers with it. Paul Goldsmith, David Pearson, and Bobby Isaac joined the USAC Tour, while Richard Petty took his Hemi drag racing.
We had been with Chrysler all those years and stuff, and so we were their racing team, basically. And so they said, okay, you can't do that, we'll go drag racing. So we went drag racing for probably 6 or 7 months, and then NASCAR finally relented that there wasn't nothing but Fords running, and the crowds were starting to fall off and all this stuff. So they said, okay, y'all can run anything from a mile down. You can't run the big superspeedways, but you could run a mile. So they just opened up Rockingham. So we got to run Rockingham, and then we ran 13 short tracks, I think, that particular year.
Without the Chrysler contingent, many of the fans stayed home. Besides allowing the Hemi back on short tracks, Bill France did something else to appease the masses. He repealed his lifelong suspension of Curtis Turner. Turner came back to NASCAR wide open. In only his 5th race, he won the American 500, the first race ever held on the brand new track at Rockingham.
I like to compete against Harbaugh. I also like to compete against Curtis. Curtis was the type of race driver that whatever he had to do to beat you, he'd go deeper, farther than anybody to try to make sure he beat you. I like that.
For 66, France announced he was allowing the return of the Hemi. In response, Ford announced the introduction of a new overhead cam engine. Fearing the new power plants would ruin competition, NASCAR adopted weight restrictions on the new Fords. Now it was the other car makers' turn to fume. On April 15th, Ford announced its own boycott of NASCAR.
Well, we were requested by a motor company to approve an engine that isn't available to the public.
What will the long-range effect of these rules be, Bill?
Well, actually, our long-range effect is to return the sport back to the drivers and the mechanics and the independent car owners, and not let any corporation make the rules of a sport.
Suddenly, Chrysler was back and Ford was missing. The promoters were against the wall again. Clay Earls of Martinsville Speedway summed up the feeling of the track owners in this quote: "We might as well plow up our racetracks and plant them with vegetable crops if we can't get assurance that the top drivers will compete in Grand National events." Ford's firm stance soon faltered when several independent drivers began putting on a show of their own. Tiger Tom Pistone took 6 top 5s in his pieced-together Ford, and Elmo Langley won 2 short-track events. But perhaps the most surprising was a young ex-modified driver in a small-block Chevelle.
Went to Oxford, Maine, and we had blown up the engine down at Bridgehampton, Long Island at the road course the Sunday before, and of course Oxford was going to be on a Tuesday night. And I was able to find a used Corvette block assembly in a Boston dealership, and bought that and went on to a little dealership to let us work on the car there right across the street from the Oxford Speedway at the time. And we worked, and we got the car ready, and got over there to the racetrack the next day, and qualified pretty good, but really dominated the event and got my first win. And what a thrill, you know, to be able to have the car perform well and then stay together, which was the big thing.
Allison's win was the first for a Chevy in 3 years. He soon took 2 more victories, taking advantage of a rule that allowed the smaller engine cars to carry less total weight. Meanwhile, the former Ford loyalists began to break ranks. Curtis Turner joined with Smokey Unick to field a Chevy, and Ned Jarrett began driving independent Fords. His unexpected retirement at season's end began an exodus of famous Ford drivers.
In '66, about the time that I retired, Junior Johnson retired, Fred Lorenzen retired within a relatively short period of time, and Marvin Panch. So the sport was losing some names that had been built up pretty good over the years, and you wondered, well, you know, can it survive all of this? But it has, and in fact it survived and progressed.
By season's end, the Ford-sponsored cars were back at the track. The second boycott in as many seasons was busted. And while Ford came out the loser, the big winner was a highly touted driver from South Carolina. As Ford protested, David Pearson wheeled his Cotton Owens Dodge to an incredible 15 victories and his first Grand National Championship. In 1967, the Fords began the season dominating the Superspeedways, with drivers like Cale Yarborough and David Pearson, who had taken over the Holman Moody ride left by Fred Lorenzen. But the bulk of the schedule was still made up of short races on short tracks, and there the Chryslers shined, especially the Petty Plymouth.
'67 was just a weird year. We started off at Daytona, and I think 7th was the best we could run down there. We just got blown away. But we started and we won a couple of 3 races, and then we'd lose a race or 2, and then you'd come back and win another one. And we wasn't doing anything different than what we'd been doing. It just all fell together.
Whatever the reason, Richard Petty was unstoppable. By the midway point, the 30-year-old from Level Cross had won 11 times, including wins at Darlington and Rockingham. Later, he set a NASCAR record with 10 straight victories and ended with an unbelievable 27 for the season.
I guess you'd have to say Richard Petty was probably one of the first naturals to come along. You know, he's probably did more to upgrade our sport than any other driver.
Richard Petty was never a bad driver. We were racing on lots of little tracks, which he was good on. And he had good, strong factory support. And the Pettys had, at that time, had some good help. They were a close family-oriented team.
Him winning 10 in a row and winning a total of 27 races was not all bad for the sport. In fact, I think it was good for the sport. I think we need a rabbit, so to speak. You need a person for someone to chase. It gives the media more to play off of. And so I don't think that it was all that bad for the sport.
During that season, Petty passed his father Lee and moved into first place in all-time Grand National wins. He still holds that honor today. Around the same time, someone decided to call him King. That honor still holds as well.
I think it was 3 or 4 of the reporters out talking one night, probably doing a little drinking too. But, you know, everybody had some kind of a nickname, and mine had always just been plain Richard Petty. And, you know, some of them tried to call you the Ramming Rocket or whatever. They was trying to pick something on there. And some of these boys just come up and, they said, you know, Richard and then King, and he's winning everything, so they just said King Richard.